The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, hello and welcome to the EUSME Centre webinar series. Good morning for everyone in Europe and good afternoon for those of you in China. Today's topic is corporate responsible CRS, corporate social responsibility. So back to 2008, the European Parliament passed a resolution affirming the importance of CSR. Also from the Chinese side, we have CSR initiatives that include law and regulation, governmental instruction and guidelines, and also non-governmental standards and organizations. For today's webinar, we have a speaker, it's Professor Richard Brubaker. He will later give an introduction of himself. But before we start with the webinar, I'd like you also to get familiar with the webinar platform. So as you can see in your upper right hand side, you will see a console, the same like in the screen now. And yeah, I will recommend you, if you have any question, please use it. You can send that question to us and we will try to answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. But if we don't have time right now, we will get back to you by email later on. Also, this webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded into the internet and will be accessible through our website. So now I will make a short introduction about the EUSME Centre. We are a project founded by the European Union. The aim of the center is to assist European SMEs to export to China, establish, develop, and maintain commercial activities in the Chinese market. So we also provide free, confidential information and advice, and we give practical support services. These are some of the center services. Like you can access all these services through our website, www.eusmecenter.org.cn. And one of the very popular services is Ask the Expert section. You can send, if you have specific questions on any topic, you can send that to us. We also do consultations face-to-face, and also we can use tools like Skype. Well, the center is very strong with the Knowledge Center. We have more than 80 publications about a lot of hot topics in China. And we do also trainings. 65% of our trainings are done in the European Union, and 35% are done in China. As today's event, we also do webinars on a wide range of topics, and we also organize events like matchmaking and networking event, both in China and Europe. We have some also e-learning modules. And we have some databases, for example, for exhibitions. We have a law database, and we also have some databases for our service providers. This is companies that offer services in China. Another useful resource we have is the hot desking. We provide free space at our center where companies trying to understand and trying to break into the Chinese market can spend a short period of time in our center. They can use our resources, and they can also access to our experts in-house. So we wish you to stay connected with us. You can do that through our website. That's a very useful tool. But you can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So that will be all from my side. And now I will give the microphone to Mr. Richard Brubaker, and he will give an introduction of himself.
All right, well, good evening, everyone, or good morning if you are in the European Union right now. My name is Rich Brubaker, and I am the founder of Collective Responsibility, which is a consulting firm based in Shanghai with operations in Hong Kong and Singapore. I've been in the region for the better part of the last 15, 16 years, with the last 12 in the mainland of China, focusing on various aspects of the economy, but most recently in sustainability. We've worked on about 200 projects focused on solving the social, environmental, and economic challenges that are faced in Asia. And so we work a lot with multinationals, but we're also working quite a bit now with SMEs and entrepreneurs who are looking to start up their own business or to crack a new market within the Asia region. So it's my pleasure to be speaking to you today about what we've been seeing over the last 10 years in China. And I'm going to be brief enough to keep you all hopefully very interested and to drive questions, and also remind you that we will have a full report out later this month, or maybe in early mid-February after Chinese New Year, getting into these details a lot and far more depth. Happy to take any of your questions as we're moving along. So I'm going to try and get to the next slide. So just kind of in general for the next 30, 35 minutes, these will be the topics that we're talking about. The tools, cases, and resources at the very end are things that we will not talk about in much depth here. In fact, the tools and the case studies will not be mentioned, but these are things you can look out for in the future through the report itself. So kind of to get started with the CSR in China, CSR has largely been defined much like it has the rest of the world. It started off with philanthropy as a topic itself, but if you were to really break it down into what corporate social responsibility meant for a company, foreign or domestic, large or small, there are some basic rules of the road, which were to obey the laws of China, or not to egregiously break them, to employ people, make money, pay taxes, and to donate a little bit of money when you had a chance or when you were asked to. And this really follows along the lines of the fact that, for much of the last 20, 25 years, China's been in developing mode. It's developing economies. It wasn't very mature. And the expectations of firms were really to help build the economy itself. It wasn't meant to be necessarily a better partner. It wasn't necessarily meant to do everything cleanly. It was really around taxes, jobs, and providing an economy locally or at a higher level. But that's really started to change as we've moved into an era where even philanthropy itself has changed, an era of philanthropy on demand, where this is basically defined by quid pro quo giving at the time, where clear rules about giving were in existence. How much to give, who to give it to, when, and who would be attendance kind of dictated the firm's amount. And so what you saw during these early days was firms would be told early on that they should donate to a certain cause, that certain people would be in the audience, that certain media mentions would be given, and this would be the amount that they had to give. But that is really, as China has been developing and turning into a more developed, mature economy, that has certainly changed quite a bit. And there's some catalysts for this, and I'll go through these quite quickly. So if you've been following China, if you live in China, you know that there are issues that the economy itself is facing. We've had labor scandals, we've had environmental scandals, product recalls, and then we had the earthquake, which is a really big moment around philanthropy. And I'll just talk about these 5 in general to kind of frame how each of these scandals had a different impact to the firms. It didn't matter large or small. It didn't really matter Chinese or foreign. But the medium-sized enterprises seemed to basically bear the brunt of the costs of any of these because they were, one, least likely to have the systems in place to provide any insulation. 2, they're less likely to have any of the connections, the power to have influence over these decisions when regulations would increase, when consumer expectations would increase. And so at the end, as a percentage of their company, they would pay higher. They may have to move their supply chain. They may have to hire new people. The cost of compliance were rising. And the expectations of compliance were certainly rising from, just do good, employ people, pay your taxes, to be fair to labor. We want safe product. Don't pollute the environment. When a nation has a crisis, address it. And when there's a scandal, you should be much more proactive about admitting there's a problem and fixing the problem. Don't wait for 300,000 children to get sick before you take action. And so this meant rising expectations for business. And this is certainly a trend that you could say is outside the realm of CSR and sustainability and more generally towards the economy. But there are a few things that we were seeing really where those catalysts were having a pressure that would change the business model. And so what started off as kind of donating checks has now turned into where we're looking at changing business models, where you're no longer able to get subsidized labor costs, subsidized air, raw inputs, where the environmental concerns are not part of the cost equation. You're seeing changing product portfolios themselves, ones that it's not sell into China the cheapest stuff you can make or generation 3. It's about focusing on quality and safety versus price and speed. And if you are an SME in the food category, if you're dealing with children, with health, anything along these tangible issues, what you're seeing is that if you're on quality and safety, your brand is rising, that you're seeing a benefit to that. But if you're on price and speed, you're probably losing some market. So it has a market mechanism. And then developing communities. This is something that started off externally with volunteering and donations. But what we're seeing is that firms, large and small, if they're able to develop their internal community, that internal core, what they're able to do is actually solidify and create loyalty within their labor, drive down labor costs, increase labor productivity, and develop actually a well-known brand around that itself. We'll get into that in a bit. So why should SMEs do CSR? There's a few reasons, and I'll let you read through them, but in essence, there's a few things on the compliance side that SMEs should be really paying attention to. And one is that they don't necessarily have the luxury of the size or the network or the jobs that may be created by a larger company that can insulate them when regulations or expectations change. And CSR is a great way to kind of stay ahead of this curve where if you're involved in your community, you're involved with your supply chain, you really pay attention to your products, you develop your own insulation. Developing a firm with strong culture of social responsibility attracts and retains productive employees. This is certainly growing more and more true, and we're seeing studies coming out in China that are around this, where hiring, retaining, and managing employees is one of the bigger issues that firms face, particularly SMEs who will lose their employees to larger firms. You know, retaining that loyalty and that productivity is something that's very key. And what we're seeing is through this research and through some of the other things is you can really develop a culture within your employees around CSR, around the initiatives, the strategy, and the issues themselves. Through these processes, you're becoming more aligned to new market opportunities. We're certainly seeing this in food and healthcare and education. You know, SMEs have a really interesting opportunity now as these externalities are becoming much more appreciated in the general market to create new markets, to create a new value proposition around green, around safe, around economical, where the brand itself stands for something more than just cheap and speedy and disposable. And the last thing is the recognition of firm values can lead ultimately to support of external stakeholders that were once typically inaccessible. We are seeing where government agencies, where academic groups, where stakeholders that were once not necessarily in the core alignment of the firm or weren't naturally willing to speak to them are now looking at them as best in class, as model companies, and there's rewards that come from that, not just kind of the certificates and the awards, but also opportunities to work with new groups for scale and to build a business around some of these issues. Each one of these we'll talk a little bit about later. So there's really, in the grand theory of CSR, there's 5 ways that we really looked at this, and that is that firms generally start off with risk and compliance. What are the laws in China? What's the minimum standard I have to meet? And for many firms, it's a truism across their supply chain as well as across their expectations with their customers. That's not long-term strategic, but it's certainly short-term, what do I need to accomplish? Engagement and efficiency, these are certainly things that are external and internal, where you're basically trying to go a little bit further than compliance. You're trying to engage off-site through donation, through volunteering. It's a program where you're trying to build bonds that feel good off-site with some new stakeholders. And then efficiency would be the supply chain aspect of this or the operational side of this, where you're kind of moving from compliance into maybe management type of CSR. And then building culture in markets. Culture it's a higher level of engagement. It's where you're really developing a culture, internal and external, that is engaging, that's self-fulfilling engagement, where you'll see real change happen within your employees, where you can have influence over your stakeholders because you have authenticity. And then on the market side, you're leveraging the spirit of CSR to create new market opportunities. You're seeing education, food safety as your opportunity, and you can leverage your own capacity to do that. As an SME, these things can happen quite quickly because you have the ability. It will just depend upon the resources available, again, which we will talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm having some issues with the slides here.
Can you hear me now, Richard?
I can, but you have control of the slide.
So before we go to the next slide, we would like to launch one of our pools. So and we will ask all the attendees to vote for it. So the question will be, what have been your biggest barrier to CSR in China? So we will give the attendees 30 seconds to answer the poll, and then we will display the results. So we will close now the votation, and we will see the results. So as you can see, many of the SMEs have problems with limited resources, and also they are not sure where to start. So I don't know if you have some comments about it.
Okay, well, we'll certainly address those top two, the limited resources and where to start. When it comes to limited resources, I think, I don't want to ruin my pitch later, but it's not always about money. It's also about your product. It's about how you can leverage your people. So if we're talking about an NGO engagement, a charitable level of engagement, there's more than money that gets involved. And this is where SMEs can actually they have to be not only creative, but they also have to align whatever programs are going to do to their core. Because limited resources, you can't waste the resources themselves. Not sure where to start. I think we'll get into that in the next portion of the presentation. Okay, so to kind of, to frame it, where do you get started? There are 5 areas where we're really looking at CSR as having the need for programming, to have a focus, a strategy around each of these 5, assuming that your business has an exposure to these 5. All of you are going to have workplace, so internal programs focused on employee well-being and job satisfaction. The fundamental compliance level here is going to be, do you meet the China labor law? And then moving to more management strategic areas, we're talking about, are you creating healthcare programs for your employees? Are you understanding their personal needs and able to address those in ways that aren't tied to a law? So you could look at flexible time, you could look at healthcare, child care, elderly care, things along those lines. Governance is a really big one lately, as you've seen with GlaxoSmithKline. And a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises get caught here, not because they themselves have governance issues, but because their supply chains or their other chains that are involved, their value chain itself, could have corruption issues, and there's exposures there. So really taking the time to figure out what the risks are, and as well as to stomp out immediately any abuses that do exist. The environment, the physical environment. This is a hot topic right now because we have smog, we have water pollution, we have other emissions that are impacting China's local communities. And this is really a local community issue that SMEs, particularly if they're in manufacturing, need to be aware of. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Community, we've already spoken a little bit about this, but really, identifying an issue or a partner that links back to the firm's either core value proposition or the core interests of employees. It gets back to workplace. And then finally, consumers. I've mentioned this earlier, where the product services themselves have to be at quality, but you also have to look at pricing and then warranty, technical service. We'll go through each one of these briefly for the next few minutes. So in the workplace, we're looking at 4 areas where you have to at least have a discussion, at least have a strategy around these. Wages and hours, that's certainly going to be a measure of compliance. EH&S, that's certainly going to be a measure of compliance. But diversity, inclusion, employee health, and wellness, these are areas where you can build culture. And I think it's important to remember that while you're building compliance, you should be building culture. And the cost, the resources involved, it doesn't have to be about money. It's going to be more about time. It's going to be more about figuring out how to include these things into your daily workplace, and then speaking with the employees to make sure that you're meeting their expectations in these 4 areas. Diversity, inclusion, employee health and wellness are certainly more important in the urban setting than it will be, say, in the rural. But employee health and safety or environment health and safety and wages and hours, those are things covered by the labor law, so you need to make sure that you're at least in compliance. The next slide is environment, and I believe that's some. And so as an SME, you really need to figure out, 1, where is your part of the value chain? What do you own? And then second, where are your exposures? Using Nike as an example, they are a design and they're a retail group. But if you were to look at their exposure in the value chain, it's primarily in production, where they don't own it. They don't own the factories. They don't necessarily own the risk legally, but they're certainly held accountable. And a lot of SMEs will fall into a similar pattern where if you're a retail brand, a lot of your environmental exposures will be in production and in materials. And as the governments really change around emissions and becoming more efficient, driving efficiency in materials and resources, you need to be aware that these mega trends are going to have an impact on your business and start to prepare around that, looking for cleaner sources where emissions aren't there, looking for fair trade or organically sourced resources. And then also at the waste stream itself, what are the wastes that are coming out of use? We've seen in some firms like Interface and Hayworth, which are on the medium to medium-large side of the business, they're actually taking control of their waste to create new materials so that they can actually create that closed loop. They're taking the environmental risk as their own and turning it around and making an opportunity. Consumer safety, this is one that has certainly been hot on social media lately with Yum Chickens and a few other scandals. This is a difficult one for an SME who may be based in another country and only have a small office in China. But for those firms that are starting off in China, this is where things that need to be really paid attention to. Product quality and safety, I think that's something that everyone talks about and is fully aware of. Product service and service pricing is something that's new. We saw this with Starbucks. We're seeing this with other brands right now where consumers are saying that it's not fair that they're paying a certain price premium in this market versus another market. At the same time, they're looking at service, return, and repair and saying, well, wait a second, your warranties are different here than they are globally, or you don't have a technical support here when you do globally. And that's not fair to the Chinese consumers. This is a trend that's only going to grow. The consumers are getting much more vocal as other brands, primarily foreign or primarily local, are having brand failures or product failures. But as an SME, because your resources are limited, you're going to have to focus on these things really from the very start as you're developing your China model, as you're developing your China level products, as you're rolling out across China. If you are going to play the compliance game and you get caught, the resources that you'll have available to fix that brand, to fix that image issue, or to fix the actual product itself, it gets much more expensive and much more difficult. And so it's something to keep in mind, is this is something consumer safety you should be really planning for up front. Community engagement, I'll briefly mention this. There are three aspects that firms need to be aware of. Philanthropy, this is donations. Employee engagement, this is volunteering. And disaster response. For philanthropy, I'll just say it's not really about the money. It's going to be about which NGOs you're working with and how you're working with them. It's going to be about the program itself. Well, I get into the paper in a lot more depth. I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a few slides. Employee engagement, one of the things to do is, find an issue that resonates with a majority of employees. Don't start from the top and say it's going to be climate change. Make it local, make it engaging, make it as easy as possible for your staff to get engaged emotionally, but also make sure that they have the time, Monday to Friday, to get out of the office for a couple hours to actually execute. Don't ask them to give it on a Saturday or Sunday when they're supposed to be spending time with their family. And then disaster response. We've certainly seen this in the various earthquakes. There's no rule here. Basically, this is a matter of where the firm, small or large, just needs to be paying attention to what the expectations are, how they're changing, and be clear about what their own response will be at the time. This is something that it largely plays out on social media, but basically up front you need to just have a couple of ideas about how you would address different disasters. Governance. There's three areas that are important. Government affairs is something that you'll see in the larger SMEs versus the small ones, because they typically don't.
Hello, Richard?
Quite quickly and quite big. It can impact not just whether or not you'll be fined, a supplier would be shut down, or an employee would be arrested. It can impact the entire brand, as we've seen with a number of issues lately, GlaxoSmithKline being the biggest one. I believe the next poll now.
Yeah. And then we will have a poll. So the poll is, which of the above areas do you think will most closely align with your business and your stakeholders? And the options for the poll are environment, governance, workplace, consumer safety, and community engagement. And we will open the poll now for votes. I give sometimes our attendees. I was saying also, Richard, that I think we experienced some technical problems. So we couldn't hear you for the last 2 minutes, so I think it will be good if you go on again over this last slide.
Oh, the last slide. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we will close now the poll and then see the results. As you can see, it's spread about the different options. So it seems the workplace is not an issue, but please go on and elaborate on it. Thanks.
Sure. So I'll elaborate on this a little. What's interesting is, when you're talking about you have limited resources and you're not quite sure what to do, a quick poll like this clearly shows that the issues are going to be governance, consumer safety, and community engagement. Community engagement tends to be easiest to get started with because you can do a single event, you can do a single volunteering, you can give a single donation, and you can build off that. In our paper, we spent a lot of time about how you build off a single event, how you create stability in these engagements so that they remain authentic, so that they remain engaging, and so they grow over time organically. governance is by far, I would say, the trickiest one because it comes down to your ability to understand and predict where the laws are going to go. If you're out of compliance in terms of bribery and those types of risks, then you should be really looking seriously at how you terminate those risks. Mitigation, being willing to tolerate the risk itself, it's no longer an option for the long term. It's something that you have to be looking at because transparency across China is growing through technology, through social media, through governments opening up new channels for individuals, consumers to provide feedback. You can't really hide from these governance issues for much longer. So to get back to governance, because of the technical difficulty, sales and distribution, supply chain, these are issues that SMEs really need to be paying attention to. Because what you'll see is that as these kickbacks come through, as these various relationships in the organization reach out and are corrupted, this becomes an organizational risk at the end of the day. It's not just about fines. It's not just about maybe a closure or the arrest of an employee. It could really undermine the organization overall. Because as we're seeing, when you clean out these governance issues, you're in many ways having to burn relationships. You can't go back to the same suppliers. And so it can mean real disruption in the business. So it's, as an organization, you need to have a very clear understanding of what governance means to you, and you need to be able to educate and engage your local staff, your local suppliers, your local distributors in that process to make sure they're clear about what you feel is right and wrong, and also back that up with ongoing checks as well. So to create a local strategy, to get a little bit more practical, there's a few things that you need to do and hopefully do well. First one is move past awareness into knowledge. We all know that problems exist, but when we get into knowledge, it's how do those issues apply to our business, apply to our context, what's important to our people, our stakeholders. Moving into that area to know, where does our core value proposition align to our stakeholder expectations and understandings of the issue and risk exposure, and then on the other side of it as well, where is it on the regulatory side as well. You need to be able to have that fundamental basis there because that provides basically the foundation for a strategy. The strategy needs to be focused and aligned around a single topic, few topics at most, but always getting back to the core of your business. If you are a retailer whose biggest exposure is environmental, and you're supplying a scholarship for a migrant student to a school, that money that you spent on that scholarship may have actually been better placed around fixing your internal issues. And so it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, like have a very clear strategy and how to execute it. Which leads me to the partners to align with. A lot of times as an SME, you won't have access to large government entities or to the large international NGOs as a starting point, which is good because in many ways you can work locally, you can work with small groups, you can work with nimble groups who will work with you on a longer term basis. The large groups tend to be very short term, very market driven around messaging and things that may not align to you. So if you can find local partners, be it nonprofit, for-profit, or government agency, you're going to find that actually if you can align their strategy and yours, your programming needs with theirs, you're going to find long-term relationships that bring real value back to your core business proposition. Don't think of CSR as just a donation. Don't look at it as just one level of partnership. Look at NGOs themselves, if you're going to engage with them, as they'll need more things than money. And what we'll show you in the case studies with Nova Fiber and with CocoMat is that they, as companies, are actually almost expanding their skill set into their partners themselves. So there's an NGO, government agency, academics. They're basically using their skills as the engagement itself, not the money. So a lot of people are worried about, I don't have much money. And it's the thing, like money is not necessarily the most critical thing when it comes to developing partnerships. It comes down to understanding what their needs are, aligning to your own needs, and then finding ways to work together. If you're an SME, if you're more medium-sized, you're going to find that there's different levels of partnerships you can create at the local level, the city level, provincial level, that really align to your own organization's size. Spend the time, and that gets back into knowledge. Figure out who really is the best person to work with, what their issues are, and have a clear strategy. And I think the last thing is it's fairly ubiquitous. Stop trying to compete. Don't go for the award. Try and find ways to be engaging. Engage externally so that you have strong partnerships, strong strategy, and you're able to have a strong impact. Then internally, a lot of CSR, particularly around the external engagements, community, workplace, these are things that you're going to find much more benefit internally than you ever will externally. It's not about brand. It's about the internal core strength of the organization. Next slide. So to really bring internal engagement up, we talked quite a bit about how to do things externally. It's really important to make sure that the staff are engaged. And I'm a personal believer that they start with day one. When the executive or the entrepreneur or the management say, we need to do something, bring the staff in early, figure out what's important to them. Because with the internal benefit being so powerful and so sustaining and really what will end up being a core centerpiece of any monitoring or ROI calculations, make sure that you're developing things that really align with them. Develop a plan for ideas that offer the earliest and widest engagement possible. Don't try and narrow people down into what you believe is the biggest crisis. Allow them to kind of drive that issue. Climate change doesn't resonate in China, but if climate change is important to you, find ways to translate it into things that are important to the average employee. Maybe it's air pollution, maybe it's energy efficiency, maybe it's healthcare for children. And that makes it personally relevant to the employee. Make it team-based. Find ways to either develop committees or small groups of people who can leverage off each other, who can balance time, who can bounce ideas back and forth with you, where they can start talking together, create a bit of energy, and really kind of take the ownership forward. Because as the executive, as the manager, what you really want to find a way to do is to get your local staff to own the programs, but also to create the ideas themselves. You'll find that they start passing these things around the office. They're going to be much better at getting the employees engaged, and they're going to be much better at making sure that it continues the long term versus just dying out after 1 year. And then respect and plan for those unable to commit at a high level. You're going to find, especially if you have a lot of salespeople in the office or a lot of supplier folks in the office, they're traveling a lot. And even if they want to engage, they may not have the time to. And I've seen a lot of firms get very frustrated because they really thought that, we have 30 employees, we should get 20 engaged, they end up with 10. You start with what you can and build out over time. You'll find that people check in and check out as their schedule allows, as their interest peaks. Next slide.
Yeah, here.
Okay. So this is kind of like if you do everything well, you're going to find that if you have a clear mission, you speak in detail about the programs, you're creating external and internal engagement, messages and mediums. You're going to find that basically you're maximizing your ROI at the end of the day. Be honest, be open to suggestions, and remain engaged. Everything should be innovative. Everything should be open to change. And the more that you're doing that, the more that you're remaining engaged, the more that you're open to suggestions, you're going to find that the ultimate ROI, not just this year's, but the return on your investment with these limited resources that you have, it's going to grow and grow and grow. And I'll talk a little bit about the mediums on the next slide. But again, you want to create a balance between these internal and externally focused messages. You want to make sure that you're aligned in your strategy internally, but also externally. And you want to make sure that the details, the investments, the engagement, make sure that they're there and that they're updating on a regular basis to what they need to be. So again, if you have limited resources, don't make grand plans. Start with something small, grow over time, and you may find that actually resources are unlocked because of that process. Next slide, please.
Hello, Richard. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but one of our attendees, Daniel, he's asking what is ROE. So I just want to make clear it's a return on investment.
So ROI is return on investment. If you put in money to improve your product quality, to donate money outside, some firms are going to call that a cost or an expense. I tend to look at it in these terms as an investment. It's your seed investment. And what you want to do is, with limited resources, you want to be able to basically show that when you put money or assign a person, assign their time to this initiative, to this strategy, that you're going to have a return. There should be a positive return to the firm, and internally and externally. And the more that you're measuring that, the more that you're actually aligning to the core mission, the easier it's going to be to understand that return. And that's all that this means. We go into much greater detail in the report itself as well. Next slide, please. I won't spend much time on this because I do want to get to the Q&A, but each part of your organization is going to have different KPIs, and they're going to want different things from this. In the report, I go back through this in more detail again. So just for frame of reference, just for now, think human relations, public relations, sales, marketing, operations, executives, employees, everyone's going to have what's important to them. And when you're looking at return on investment, if human relations gives a little bit of money and public relations gives a little bit of money, they're going to expect different things. So you have to really learn how to balance that. And so that's really key to the ROI, because if you're doing a volunteer event, HR might find a really high return. PR might find a medium. Operations find zero. And what you're going to find is, as you're building your programs, as you're building your culture, these groups are going to clash and say, hey, you know, it's benefiting them and not me. Why should I engage? And so it's really internally understanding and maximizing your ROI allows you to create higher levels of engagement. Next slide. And I believe this is the last slide. At the end of the day, the other thing you have to do well is you have to communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it, how it aligns to your firm. Internally, really look at pictures and video as the main medium. You're trying to get people excited or keep them excited. Show them what other employees are doing so that the new employees can come in and you're really building that culture. We find that this is probably one of the most effective ways to keep the engagement going internally. Just send emails, a newsletter if you have it, or tack a picture on the luncheon bulletin board, or next to the printer. Let people see what's going on. Externally, as SMEs, you're not going to have access to TV budgets and massive PR firms, so you have to get really creative. Again, you're not going to try and be, it has to be very authentic, because you're going to be relying upon social media primarily, but also the people you're externally communicating to, they're going to be closer to you. They're going to be people that you probably know to start with, but also they're going to try and give you feedback. So make sure it's very authentic. Show pictures and video again, describe the events, and make sure in each time try and create that alignment to the strategy of the firm. Make sure they understand why you're doing it, how you're doing it, what the expectations are going forward. Don't just say we're trying to be a part of climate change and we're going to offset. Make sure that you really align to the strategy, your people, your product, the entire way. Getting back to the core of this presentation, the closer any of your strategy or programs are to your core mission and to your employees, the easier communication gets. If it's not in line, it gets more difficult, and that mismatch between communicating authentically and communicating a little bit inauthentically starts to grow. And that's something that SMEs really, again, you can't afford to look like you're just putting out a message so that everyone takes notice. And I believe the rest of the time is for Q&A.
Hello, Richard. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, as you said, now we open the webinar for questions. and we will encourage all the attendees to ask us questions. So I think your presentation was really interesting, and one of the takeouts I will take from it is like, with CSRs you can tackle one of the big issues in China for USMEs, that it will be the big turnover for employees. So of course it's a very good way to keep and retain staff in China. So we have a question.
Correct.
Yeah. So we have a question from PRS from Denmark, and she was asking, how do you distinguish between raising expectations toward businesses and towards governments?
So at this point, I think we've seen some studies. Ogilvy did a fantastic survey about 2 years ago of 5,000 Chinese individuals, and they basically asked who has the power, who has the responsibility to act on these issues. And it kind of, everyone said, about 60% said that it's the government that has the power, and 47% said they have the responsibility. And then for individuals, they said, okay, 20% of us have the power, but 50% say we are responsible for acting. And then they said, okay, business has the power to act. They're 50% able to act, but they only have 10% to actually be responsible for acting. And so the real issue is the fact that if you're a business, you're going to have two dynamics. The first one is going to be push. It's going to be the government pushes you forward through compliance, through more than compliance. It might be a national government, it might be an international coalition of governments, but they're going to be setting rules, regulations, policy, and pricing that push the business. And then the other side is going to be the consumers, the market, NGOs, media, who pull you into a place where they feel is in their compliance. Now, with government regulations, you can argue that those are quite clear. How they're enforced may or may not be clear, but the rules and regulations are clear. But if you look at the other side of it, NGOs, media, consumers, citizens, their expectations and ability to execute on those expectations, it changes minute to minute. So firms ultimately are the ones who are going to be paying for it. The question is, are they going to be pushed or pulled into it? The expectations of business are rising on both sides.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. As you mentioned during the webinar, the EUSME Centre is getting ready to publish a report that you wrote for us regarding the CSR, and I think this report will be very useful for USMEs. They will also be able to see a lot of tools and resources they will be able to use. So we will try to have it published February or the latest on March. So I will ask all the attendees, which definitely will be interested on is to have a look at it and download it from our website. Also, as you mentioned, we will have 2 case studies, and I think that will really reflect on some of the points you make. It's not something about making donation. It's something that it really benefits the structure and the business the USMEs are trying to do in China. So I think we still have a little bit of time to make some other questions, and one from Marta Mesoreno will be, do you think the same politics will work for Chinese companies in other countries, like in Europe, for instance?
That's a great question, Marta. From what we're seeing, the Chinese are actually struggling to understand what the standards are globally. And so the politics of it, I think, is still left to be seen. You can use the EU's regulations on airliners as an example. If it hurts Chinese companies and they feel that it's hurting their ability to compete in the global market, I think the political environment is only going to get more tenuous. But if it's a very clear rule around, say, environmental emissions or labor, and there doesn't seem to be a natural connection or a clear connection to the Chinese business or foreign business maybe on a wider level, then I don't think that you'll see much politics coming in from there. They will accept regulation, they'll accept they have to comply, but then the politics, say like in Africa for Chinese companies, may be the fact that compliance isn't really enough. We saw this in Bangladesh with the factory implosions and the fires. You know, that's the other thing is politically right now what you're seeing is a lot of Chinese firms moving into areas where these structures, these regulations aren't necessarily there, so their compliance isn't a problem, and that's creating local pushback on Chinese firms. So again, it's that push and pull mechanism.
Hey Richard, thank you very much. We have another question from Yuchi Yan. I think it's a local, and I think it's interesting. And she's asking if there is a way to evaluate NGOs and their programs in China. Can you give some recommendations on that?
So yes, there is a group called the China Foundation Center in Beijing. And let's be clear about the NGOs that they are ranking. They're ranking the government-organized, non-government organizations, otherwise known as gongos. And they are in partnership with the Red Cross and Ministry of Civil Affairs, and they're doing rankings basically based on their administration cost structure. We can debate the effectiveness, but more than, I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's only for a certain group of NGOs. There's nothing that we've seen yet that is an official ranking of the grassroots NGOs. However, if you want to know about the grassroots NGOs, I would recommend that you look at Give to Asia. That's GIVE, the number 2, asia.org, because they maintain a large database of live and previous projects that they've had with local NGOs, with academic institutions. And it's not necessarily a ranking or tells you how effective they are, but all those NGOs had to go through a vetting process. They're largely with foreign donors, and so if you're looking for some ideas or some level, they've gone through a bit more vetting than your average NGO in China right now.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I have another question. This will be more specific, and it's from a company in the IT business. And well, as you said, you mentioned that the first step should be like define which field is more relevant for the company. So could you recommend to companies that are active in IT business, for example, like software development? Can you give some recommendations to them?
So I think for an IT firm, a couple things you clearly have to pay attention to are governance around government affairs, censorship, issues of those nature. You have to be in compliance on that, or you have an issue. And it depends on what part of the IT system you're in. We've been talking a lot with the IT firms on the energy side, on equipment side, making sure that the electronics themselves being manufactured are being manufactured in a clean way, but also getting back down to that idea of technical and service support guarantees. That comes in on the consumer side. There's multiple, it really depends upon the IT business itself. But if you're looking like for an external engagement, leveraging IT to develop a volunteer or a donation or something along those lines, I would be aligning around the idea of education or maybe elderly access to IT or elderly access to technology.
Thank you, Richard. We have another question. It's from Joseph Polak. And he's asking how far from Beijing and other big cities we can speak about a corporate social responsibility. And I think what he meant with this is like, outside like the tier 1 cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and the others, like it's possible for SMEs with businesses in small cities, in rural areas, it's possible for them to implement some corporate social responsibility.
Definitely. It depends on how you want to do it. So let's say that you're manufacturing in a third-tier city and you have locals or migrants who are on the lower end of the poverty scale. You can do programming with them. You can basically focus all your donations and all your volunteering on that group, but you can also look at how you educate that group so that they can then come up. One of the more interesting employee engagement programs I've been seeing lately is where instead of having separate labor pools for staff and labor. So executives and management come out of colleges, and staff or labor comes off of the farm or out of a talent pool. Trying to develop that staff that came into the factory onto the line itself and upgrading them over time through different educational opportunities. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is, if you're going to be investing in your own factory, you certainly have to be on environment and society very cognizant of what's going on locally. We've heard of factories being turned down now because the mayors of the city or the province, they don't have the quota anymore for emissions for new factories, or they don't have the power in that area to supply to a heavy user. So you have to really be aware of the social and economic conditions before you go in there if you're on the manufacturing side. And then I think in the future, if you're talking about sales, product sales, that's something that's growing over time. A lot of the product sales for safe children's food and things like that, those are actually going into the third, fourth, fifth tier markets where they have no access to it and where they are suspect of everything. So I think from every aspect of the business, you could say, yes, CSR and sustainability for a firm has a play or has an angle in China's other cities.
Well, thanks for your comments again, Richard. So I think we're running out of time now. I see some of the questions we still have. They are asking about what are the possibilities to do checks on local Chinese NGOs, and I think this might be something that we will be able to address in the report you are preparing, since it's not published yet. So I think it's a good takeout we get from the audience. So I would like to thank you very much for the webinar. It was very interesting. Thanks to all the attendees for joining us. And well, we don't have more webinars planned before the Chinese New Year, which will start on the 31st of January. So I would like to wish everyone a happy New Year of the Horse, and I hope you join future webinars. So please log in onto our website, and we will be very happy to provide services to you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, or have a good day ahead if you're in Europe.
Thanks, everyone.